Hello, I'm Joshua and I'm an INTP, and first and foremost I would like to say thank you for viewing this video. Okay, and the topic of this video will be on creativity, but on the characteristics or traits, the characteristic traits of what researchers, or of whom researchers call highly creative individuals. And this is being based upon Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's research or book on creativity on the lives of 91 creative individuals. At least this is where these traits have been extrapolated from within any paper you read in positive psychology or on the research of creativity in terms of personality and characteristics. So I would first like to begin with saying that the number one, at least term that could be associated with a creative individual is complexity, and I would say secondarily contradiction. So highly creative people are complex and contradictory in their presentation and in their general makeup. Before I go any further into this, I would like to, in weighing in regards to my thoughts on MBTI, or Jungian typology and personality in general, it seems that various aspects of temperament, not necessarily personality, but temperament, that which personality emerges from, is largely genetic, and there seems to be a base set of traits that a person comes into the world with, but is a person fixed in living out these base set of traits or in displaying them in any one manner per se? Is that you take some ingredients and can you only represent, if you take flour, if you take eggs, if you take butter, and you take milk, is all that you can make out of those ingredients a cake? Not necessarily. You can do many things with those ingredients. You're not gonna. You can get much more than just a cake out of that. I'm not a chef. I'm not a baker, so I'm not going to be able to come up with any actual examples, but I think, well, at least bread is an example, I suppose. It's just that you don't exactly have to get a cake, and then even all the types of bread one can make, it doesn't have to be just a loaf of bread, even at that. There's a great deal of variation, so just because people come with set temperamental characteristics, the way in which those characteristics will be displayed are going to differ amongst individuals, and there's going to be a tremendous amount of variance, even though the people, they do fit into these general classes and structures of temperament insofar as that there's archetypal models for personality, but it is not to say that the characteristics that one displays simply comes from their personality, and it's not to say that there aren't other physiological factors that weigh in necessarily on the way that somebody's character and their personality is represented to other people. And typology is not about the what, but about the why. So typology is about the why, not about the what. I'm not going to tell you what a person should behave like or what a person could be or do given their personality per se. So with that said, it seems that complexity and contradiction are the one and two characteristics, or just the overall arcing words that could be superimposed on the thought of a highly creative individual. And why this is because Mihai Csikszentmihalyi and other researchers have shown that in dimensions at which people consistently fall into various rigid or binary categories, it seems that highly creative people don't fall into these categories. And the first one I would start with is extraversion and introversion. Now, to me, this doesn't contradict Jung's work, because in Jung's original proposition of typology, he said that people, even if they're introverted, they have an extroverted function that they lead with. Even if they're extroverted, they have an introverted function that they lead with. So, but in Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's research and other researchers who have cooperated with Mihai Csikszentmihalyi found, Martin Gardner and other uh, uh, thinkers and researchers have found that people who are highly creative, they're introverted and extroverted at the same time, roughly. And because this is a behavioral model, they're not stemming from the Jungian standpoint and looking at introversion and extroversion as one's autonomic nervous system disposition, or the physiological, biological disposition one has, nor the direction of libido, or just the Jungian model. They're not coming from the Eysenck's perspective. They're not coming from the Jungian perspective. They're starting from a behavioral standpoint and saying that the behaviors and characteristics that the person exhibits and shows to the world tend to be ones of extroversion and introversion simultaneously. So you can have somebody that will self-identify as an introvert, but they're fairly outgoing and they're willing to discuss and trade ideas and be with people and be hyper-exploratory and engaging in an environment rather than being simply secluded and to themselves consistently. And I think that this is something that's indicative of everybody's personality. But it is something that Mihai Csikszentmihalyi and other researchers have identified as a characteristic of highly creative people. They're, as most people, at least when they take questionnaires or when they take the Big Five model questionnaire or indicator of personality, people fairly consistently test either as introvert or an extrovert. There are people who are in the middle of ambivert, and ambivert is a very confusing, it can be a confusing term for a lot of people, but what ambivert means isn't necessarily that you're both introverted and extroverted. It means you have an interplay of both qualities, but you're neither introverted nor extroverted. You're something classically different. It seems that, so if you think you're ambiverted, that doesn't mean you're highly creative. It seems that highly creative people, they have traits, or they identify with introversion, but show very powerful levels of extroversion simultaneously. It's not as if they have a collection or amalgamation of these things. They seem to be polar opposite people at the same time, at least in what they present to another person. Which that's interesting, but I think that that's something that's within every individual, especially if you're looking at this through the Jungian model, which the research isn't. So next would be that highly creative people, they have two types of thinking that they consistently use, and researchers have called this, refer to these two thinking patterns. Well, in Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's research, he says, he contrasts that highly creative people are convergent in their thinking and divergent in their thinking. They use both models of thinking and think fast and think slowly. It's type 1 thinking versus type 2 thinking. They can be very analytical and coming to singular conclusions about things, but while at the same time taking in a breadth of associations and looking at things through a horizontal chain of reasoning rather than a linear chain of reasoning, not necessarily to arrive at any conclusion, but to generate possibilities and new ways of viewing a thing. And I think that again is something that, well, one, convergent and divergent thinking, those aren't things that at least lend themselves to me to believe that there's any sort of genetic component to this per se, and one's ability for either convergent or divergent thinking. People can very well train this in themselves to be well adept at both. I don't know necessarily if highly creative people are overly profound in this ability, because there's a very tight correlation between one's ability to create something and one's level of expertise. So I don't really know what generates it, but it doesn't seem to be a genetic impetus. But I'll say that people who are have schizotype B or low latent inhibition, it's what they're able to do is to generate loose associations and create all these new associations. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they can converge these associations to one singular conclusion or anything of that nature. There seems to be just genetic factors that lean one to either being more convergent in their thinking or divergent in their thinking, but they're not things that are extant in most people, in most individuals, and the general population. And it seems like the creative individuals, they have both, so there's this didact between the two opposite polarities that have been brought together to have this more efficient way of problem solving, roughly. And it seems that it comes down a lot of times to processes. Next, it seems that highly creative people are have a high level of energy, a high level of physical energy, but at the same time rest a considerable amount. They get a tremendous amount of work done. They're fairly prolific, but they spend a lot of time in contemplation and rest and still and meditation and sleeping. So this is something that's quite interesting about highly creative people, people who tend to have expertise in a thing, or high level performers, athletes, musicians, whatever, through the gambit. It seems that when you do deep work or focused work, or deep focused work as Cal Newport calls it, or deep practice or deliberate practice as K. Anders Ericsson calls it, that there's a tremendous taxing on the glucose levels in the brain and in the body in some respects, whether you're an athlete or whether you're an intellectual. Either you're taxing the sugars in your brain if you're doing a high level of intellectual activity, or you're taxing the sugars in your body if you're doing a high level of athletic activity. So there's a tremendous amount of rest that's needed for any individual doing deep work. It seems that deep work or deliberate practice seems that these individuals, they're typified for how much activity they have and for how much sleep they consume as well, or just how often they sleep. So there's just this dichotomy between having a high amount of energy and also needing a tremendous amount of rest. And this is also within the highly creative individual. Also, highly creative individuals are disciplined yet playful, and it's not a new idea. Carl Jung originally talked about the idea of serious play in the expert, or in the genius, and or in the master. I don't know who really I just remember Carl Jung is the one who conceived the idea of serious play. I remember hearing and reading that paper, and I remember hearing it again in Robert Greene's book Mastery. He referenced Carl Jung in that vein, but it seems that whether one's saying it, they're an expert, or they're a master, or they're a genius, whatever word someone wants to use for an individual with profound abilities, insofar as their ability to be highly functionally creative, that they have this aspect to them where they're extremely playful with their work, but extremely stringent and disciplined and deliberative with it at the same time, which again seems to be contradictory. I suppose the reason that these things don't seem contradictory to me is because I think that anybody who is creative essentially learns these things through the creative process, because I think they're things that when you try to be creative, the process of being creative naturally demands out of you, rather than it being something that's extant within the individual given any sort of initial temperamental factors. And there's things that can lead people to certain directions, but I don't think it's the last cause for anything. And so moving on, it also seems that highly creative people are able to mix being conservative with highly rebellious. And this comes to the fact that if anyone needs, and if anybody desires to be highly creative, they have to be an expert. At the bottom line, they have to have adopted and internalized some sort of culture that already exists insofar as a domain of knowledge per se. It has to be stored within the individual. They have to have such strong and profound mental representations in their minds, at least what K. Anders Ericsson calls mental representation, and a very voluminous number of mental representations going on in their mind to be able to have what many researchers call conceptual fluidity with ideas. So if you want to be highly creative or imaginative, I mentioned that in my video on imagination, then you need to be an expert. But you also have to be somewhat intuitive and flippant at the same time. And this is what Csikszentmihalyi means about them being conservative and rebellious, because there comes a certain point in time where you sort of accumulate all these models and make the finest mental representations you can make in your mind, but then you have to jump straight clear away from them and trying to approach the unknown and what's not understood. And so in the creative process, there always seems to be this interplay between stability and chaos. And so there's just, as much as the creative person has this very solid foundation, they have a tendency, or at least a knowledge and a drive, to go out and be fairly rebellious, and rebellious insofar as answering questions and solving problems, stepping away from what we already know and going to what we don't know, and not being afraid to go there. I think rebellion per se is a rather strong word. I just think that they're open to novelty while being conscientious to a certain extent, and observant of previous traditions that came before them. I think anybody that tries to do anything realizes that they have to do that. Anybody who's trying to do anything is too general and vague of a statement, but I mean to say that if one wants to even be able to do something remotely creative, you have to know what other people have done, and you have to know where things end so that you even have the accurate place to even begin in your work. And just Newton's classic quote, "I stand on the shoulder of giants." You have to stand on other people's shoulders to get to some new height. And so it leads me to the next point. It seems that highly creative people are very confident or have a sense of pride, while at the same time being very humble and unassuming. And I suppose this is a dichotomy for most people, because most people's minds work, I don't know, but I don't have these stringent dichotomies in my mind, and I'm okay with contradiction and ambiguity going on, so these things don't seem completely contradictory to me. I think one can be confident but extremely humble at the same time, and I think why, or at least why Csikszentmihalyi says that creative individuals are both confident and prideful, is because at the bottom line they know that they have achieved, because he was looking at people who had already made creative achievements within the seminal creative achievements within their field, or at least comparable creative achievements. They're highly creative professionals, and so he noticed that they knew that they had achieved more than most other people, but they knew what I said previously, that they stood on the shoulders of giants, and that they were able to keep their work in perspective with other great individuals in their field, and sort of having a reverence and deference for the work that came before them and the people that came before them, and also seeing that there's a great deal of luck involved in being highly creative, or being or your creativity and what you produce having some sort of success and effect on a larger populace. It's just that I think it's a sober viewpoint of the world in some respects. It's just, that you've done great things, but at the same time that there's a tremendous amount of work involved in it, and there's many people's work that you had to base your things on, so it's not as if you're a lone individual out there. Excuse me. And there's just a tremendous amount of luck involved in it, and so it seems to create this dichotomy in which Mihai Csikszentmihalyi said is different from the general population insofar as they're confident and pride and even have a sense of pride to them, but at the same time have a sense of humility and even lowliness in them at times. Okay, and it moves me to the next point, where it seems that highly creative individuals, they have a great sense of pain and suffering in life while also having an enormous amount of joy and adulation from it. So I think, again, that's not something that's too strange. Now, where there is the sort of connection and personality disorders is that roughly that can sound to one like being bipolar or manic depressive. And I think just highly creative individuals, at least in the way Mihai Csikszentmihalyi defines it, if you have all these sort of contradictions existing within you, or you're expressing these contradictions to the world, I think that the individual is standing from a basis of just examining reality and the most sober lens that they can, and just accepting what things are. I think that they're just able to understand reality to an extent where they're human in this, and they realize that there's pain and there's suffering, but there's also a great deal of joy and privilege in living out existence and being a human being. But that's something it seems that highly creative people are able to do. Also, highly creative people tend to be androgynous, and so when Mihai Csikszentmihalyi says androgynous, he doesn't mean gay or sexually inert. What he means is that they possess hyper masculine traits, say if they're a man, but then possess strong feminine qualities to them as well. If they're a woman, they possess hyper feminine nature, but then have sort of aggressive and strong masculine tendencies to themselves as well. They just have an androgynous palette to themselves, and I think if anybody's honest with themselves, that's most people per se. But I mean, again, I just may be biased in my perspective because I don't think I'm a highly creative individual insofar as that I've created anything that anybody's going to call seminal. But I see that even from myself and people I know, just regular lay people who haven't really achieved much or done much with their lives, that most people have androgynous qualities to them, but it seems that highly creative people, they have what Mihai Csikszentmihalyi considers the best of both sexes. And what he means by sexes is just literally the polarity of sexual energy. Or do you have a masculine disposition to the world, or do you have a feminine disposition to the world? One where you're constantly piercing reality and penetrating it to some extent and being aggressive and acting on it. Are you passively receiving things, nurturing things, and creating and gestating things within yourself and sharing them? And you just notices that highly creative people, whether they're male or female, are capable of doing both and hold these things going on all at the same time. So I suppose this is why it seems so profound to most researchers, is that it's not that highly creative people show up any different way necessarily in one domain or just in one instance versus another. It seems that they embody this at all times. So it's just they're a walking contradiction in so many ways and just highly complex. Now, what I will say is in regards to what does this mean, I think about being highly creative in one's temperament and one's personality, well, I think I alluded to it earlier. I think that if one, I think two things. If you want to solve problems, or if you're going to be a top professional, so say you have a goal, say you have a job, say you want to discover something, say you want to achieve something, if it's worth achieving or if it's worth having, I know that's a qualitative statement, I would say if you just want to be within doing in a statistical categorization or just a ranking hierarchy so that you can get some palpability off of what I'm saying. If you want to be in the top 5, let's say for achievements, let's say for income earned, or whatever metric you can think, or papers written, or discoveries made, or pieces played, works drawn, novels written, whatever. If you want to be in the top 5, you need to be creative. It's just it's a necessity to be a expert or a professional, or to have high performance. If you want to be a high performer, you're going to have a high level of creativity. Even in sports, I don't think it's necessary. I know it's Michael Jordan's skills that set him apart from a lot of the other players, but it's also Michael Jordan's ability to create things in the moment that was rather alarming and very difficult for other people to reproduce. Same with Dr. J. It just seems that I think you see it with most athletes in general, even things like athletics, there just seems to be a creative aspect to it insofar as being a high performer or the best performer in the field. So I think that if anybody has those goals, they're going to approximate and appropriate themselves, or at least, approximate and appropriate themselves towards the creative process. It's something that they're going to do, and I think that the creative process superimposes a collection of characteristics and traits on top of their personality. You have the personality you have, but by way of going through this process, because you've also had to have gone through the process of expertise, or what at least Robert Greene calls mastery, to even be able to produce these phenomena, or to even be able to get in the game necessarily. So I think the individual themselves, they have the temperament and they have the personality subsequent from the temperament they're born with, and then what's superimposed through their efforts and through their engagement in this process, or just the drive itself to achieve something, is a personality or a set of characteristics that display themselves, and those would be the ones that Mihai Csikszentmihalyi identifies in his book Creativity. Does that now imply that I think that means that creativity can be taught? No, I don't think it can be taught, because even it's like you can't motivate someone to be the top performer or the best performer in their field. It's something that people have to choose for themselves, and it's like even in domains of knowledge, teachers, they're facilitators. They don't actually, the most that they can do is inundate a person and culturize them, but actually producing the things and taking the leaps and making the risk and going out there, thrusting yourself into the chaotic process, and invoking and transforming yourself into a creative entity. To some respects, nobody can do that for you. You just have to do it yourself. And I don't think that that's something you can. Obviously, you can't teach that to something, because it's not. I don't think it's just. But I've said this in previous videos. I don't think creativity is just this one localized phenomena, like divergent thinking, or just a lot of the neurophysiological traits or characteristics that researchers have ascribed to creativity. I think it's an amalgamation of things, per se, but that's just a video that I decided to make because I think it fits with the On Creativity series, and is bringing it to a completion, though there's another idea that's in my mind that's nested that I need to do more thought on before I release it, but this will be at least if not the last, the second to last video on the On Creativity series. So thank you for watching, and hopefully you found this insightful.